Welcome to the fifth and final module of the CompTIA PenTest Plus training series, and in this module we're going to be talking about post-exploitation and lateral movement. And up until this point we've talked about preparing for the engagement, doing reconnaissance, vulnerability analysis, and exploiting those vulnerabilities, which was the last module, which was all about attacks and exploitation. And now that you've exploited the network or exploited the human or exploited the systems, you need to think about what you're going to do post that exploitation. So what do you do after you've gotten in, right? What is the next level? What is the next step? And it's called the action on the objective. So this is technically what is on the Lockheed Martin attack chain. It's the last step. It's towards the very end of it, where we just talk about the action on the objectives. And that is what you would do once the exploitation itself has been done, right? It all falls under post-exploitation, and lateral movement is one of those big topics under post-exploitation, which is moving from the current computer that you're in into another one, into another one, into another one, and ultimately using the various machines that are available at that experience level or that privilege level, and then gaining higher privileges, which would be considered privilege escalation. So there's post-exploitation. Underneath post-exploitation, we have lateral movement, and then we have privilege escalation and a variety of other things that you could be doing in post-exploitation, like data exfiltration and ransomware, etc., etc. So there are a lot of things that you can do, but it's ultimately taking the actions towards your final objective, right? That's basically what post-exploitation encompasses. Now, for section 5.1 of module 5, we're going to be talking about establishing and maintaining persistence, which is the very first layer of post-exploitation. And really what this means is, imagine that you've done a bunch of work, very hard work, and a lot of tedious, nuanced, detailed work to get into the system that you're in, right? You've developed malware, you've developed payloads, and you've just done so much work, days and weeks worth of work, sometimes months worth of work to get into that one system that you're in. And now you don't want to lose that access, right? So maintaining persistence means your remote control of it, or the exploit that you have, that control that you have of this machine persists. You actually stay in that machine, right? Or at least develop some kind of method where you can keep logging into that machine without having to go through the same series of steps that you went through the first time, because there's a very big possibility that they'll find out what happened and then they'll patch that vulnerability and you won't be able to enter that system anymore. So there are multiple reasons why you want to maintain persistence and give yourself continued access to that system or that network, etc. So you want to establish persistence, and then you want to maintain persistence. So just to kind of read this overview here, persistence is critical for attackers to maintain access, and this keeps happening. This is one of the most annoying things that keeps happening. But persistence is critical for attackers to maintain access to compromised systems after initial exploitation. Without persistence, an attacker's foothold is lost if the victim reboots their system or terminates a process. Attackers use scheduled tasks, service creation, reverse shells, and backdoors. Or you create new users, or there are a variety of different things that you could be doing. And all of this ensures continued access. That's kind of the key piece here. Command and control, also known as C2. So there's C2 frameworks like Cobalt Strike and Empire, which help manage infected hosts. Cobalt Strike is a really big vulnerability that was exploited. And so there are a good amount of intrusion detection systems and firewalls and antivirus systems that will detect for the signatures of Cobalt Strike and or Empire. So if these are things that you would want to use, you have to find different ways to either encode them so that you can get past those antivirus or defensive mechanisms, basically. But there are frameworks that actually do exist that can help you manage infected hosts, right? and establish and maintain that persistence. Now in this video, in this section, we're going to be talking about scheduled tasks and service creation for persistence. We're going to be talking about reverse shells and backdoor implantation, and using C2 frameworks for long-term control, for example, Cobalt Strike and Empire. Now, one of the things that is actually really lucky is that for the junior pen tester playlist, I released something recently for Linux privilege escalation. And I also released an episode right before that for shells, bind shells, reverse shells, and things like that. So the shells video is called What the Shell, and the Linux privilege escalation is called Linux privilege escalation. And so those two videos, they're actually very long videos. I think maybe 2.5 hours easily, 2.5, 3 hours, something like that. And they're very in-depth. So you'll actually learn a lot about reverse shells and bind shells and just shells in general so that you can establish these remote connections. And then in the Linux privilege escalation video, we talked about scheduled tasks and service creation and all that stuff. And then this weekend, I'm going to be doing the Windows privilege escalation, where we'll be going through similar ideas, but for the Windows machines. So these two topics right here, there's actually, by the time that you probably see this video, there are going to be other videos that will be supplementary to this, that will make you really skilled at this concept and help you understand it on a deeper level. And of course, using C2 frameworks for long-term control. So for example, the Cobalt Strike and Empire frameworks, we're going to be talking about in this particular video. So you'll have a really good understanding of what they are and how they work and how you can use them to establish and maintain persistence. Now, real quick, let's talk about Hackaholics Anonymous and how you can get access to this notes document, as well as the practice questions, etc., and all of the scripts that we're going to develop at the end of this training series for the automation element of attacks and for everything else that you need to know for your practical labs and all of that, and how you can get access to that through Hackaholics Anonymous. And then from there, we'll dive deep into the course contents for this episode. To get the PenTest Plus notes, practice questions, and to join a supportive community of like-minded people like you, consider joining the Hackaholics Anonymous membership community. We have 4 tiers: the supporter, the agent, the guardian, and the master. And each tier gets their own Discord server and early access to content. The agent, guardian, and master levels will get exclusive content like line-by-line code explanations for how to create cybersecurity and PenTest Plus scripts, like exclusive downloads that they will get. For example, the notes document for this PenTest Plus and everything that I'm using for the lectures, as well as all of the practice questions and everything else that will go along that will be made for the scripts and everything else that we're going to be doing for the PenTest Plus training series. There will be free pre-made monthly Python automations that have to do with system administration, cybersecurity defense, as well as, of course, PenTest Plus and ethical hacking. And then there's going to be monthly live streams with me every single month, plus so many other things that you would get as a part of being a member of Hackaholics Anonymous in these tiers. To join, you can simply click the link in the description below, or you can go to our homepage and click the join button there, or you can go to youtube.com/@HankHacksHackers/join, and you'll be able to join Hackaholics Anonymous. Now, without further ado, let us continue with PenTest Plus. Okay, so let's talk about scheduled tasks and service creation. And underneath that, of course, we have scheduled tasks for persistence. And this can apply to Windows and Linux machines, because both Windows and Linux machines have scheduled tasks. And underneath Linux, or I should say over Linux, we have Unix, and Unix applies to Mac OS as well as actual traditional Linux machines. So both Windows and Unix, Linux have scheduled tasks. It just depends on how those scheduled tasks are set up, or what kind of process you use to set them up. For example, when you're doing it inside of the command line for Linux or for Windows, there is a certain process, but Windows actually tends to be very user-friendly for creating scheduled tasks, because you can actually literally like right-click on something and do run at startup or run at intervals, etc., and you can actually choose how you want to run something on a scheduled manner. Now, the key piece is when you want to make something run and make it seem like it's just a normal scheduled task. But when it actually runs a script, for example, this payload, this executable payload, ends up running when that scheduled task runs. And then when it actually happens, you end up getting some kind of a remote shell. And in a really perfect world, that remote shell will also give you admin access or root access. And this is what we did in the Linux privilege escalation video for Junior Pentester playlist. So when you go through that, the exercises that we were running under scheduled tasks, they were giving us root access to the machine. Root is basically the Linux version of admin access. And as a root or an admin user, you get to now create users and add them to the admin groups and do a variety of other things that are only available to that admin user and the root user, which is essentially the highest level of privilege that you can get on a machine. So if you can get root access or admin access through a scheduled task, then you're pretty much solid. Like, you can do essentially anything that you want at that point. And it's kind of like the holy grail when it comes down to pen testing. That's where you want to end up, is you want to give yourself root access and then maybe even create a brand new user for whom you have the password and all of that is also in the administrator group or inside of the sudoers group or something along those lines, that you can start doing anything that you need to do with that new user. For example, create other users, or just do a bunch of stuff that is only limited to the admin user. And then you can do it persistently. You can do it repeatedly without having to run through all of the motions that you had to run through to get that initial foothold on the system. So, all of that being said, if you want to create a persistent scheduled task on Windows, for example, you can run the SCH tasks, and then you would create one, and then you're going to do a minute interval, right? What is this? It says every minute as system, which is running under the system user. This is the payload that's going to be running, and the name itself, I believe, that's going to be assigned to the task is the Windows update. So when if somebody sees the scheduled task list, they'll be like, oh, they're just running Windows update. But the actual thing that they're running is this payload right here, and then it's supposed to be running every minute as the system user. So this is one of the greatest things that you can do for yourself. So basically every minute this payload will run, and then whatever the payload was coded to do, it'll do exactly what it needs to do. And then it runs it as the system user, which means that if it's creating a new shell, or if it's running some kind of a service in the background that's supposed to maintain a C2 command and control connection, whatever it is, it's doing it as a system user. And the system user is essentially an admin user, right? The system will have the highest level of privileges, very similar to what an admin can do. So this is just one example of this. So if you see something in the examination, or if you see something in the future where you see it's a scheduled task command, right? This is what's being initiated. And then you see that it's being created, and then the schedule itself is every minute. And this MO1, I want to try to understand better, so I'm going to look at this full command as a whole. By the way, I have not seen this command in advance, so I'm going to explain it to you to my best knowledge, but then when I run short, I find information for you just to make sure you have the full picture. And people tend to judge me in the comment section because they think I'm supposed to be a master of everything as I go through these things. And it's like, okay, well, I'm also a student, and I'm just sharing all the information that has served useful to me and the information that I've used for my exams and things like that. So anyways, that I kind of digressed a little bit, but I'm going to give you exactly piece by piece what this whole thing does. Most of it I'm going to just brush through because I already understand it for the most part. The only thing that I really want to get clarification on is this MO1 element. But it's basically you're creating something scheduled on a minute, and it might be the number of the minutes, right? So for example, it's like when you see SC minute is how it's counting, and then how many minutes is 1 minute. So I think that might be the way that that breaks down. I'm pretty confident now that that's how that breaks down. And then the task name is Windows Update, and then the task itself that's going to be running is going to be this executable right here, and it's running under the system user. But just to clarify and just to verify for sure, we're just going to copy this and we're going to go ahead and get an explanation of it, and then we'll move on. Okay, so schedule task creates a new scheduled task. SC minute specifies the schedule type as minutes, so meaning that the task will run at regular minute intervals. MO1 specifies the modifier for the schedule type, in this case running the task every 1 minute. Okay, very good. That's pretty much what I wanted to know. The task name is going to be Windows Update, and the task, the TR flag right here, the option, specifies the action to be executed, in this case running the executable file payload.exe, and then running it under the system user system privileges, which is the highest level of privilege on a Windows system. In essence, this command creates a scheduled task that runs a potentially malicious executable payload every minute and under system privileges. Great. The Linux version of this would be a cron job, right? So you can echo a command into this specific file right here. The cron tab file, the etc cron tab file, is what stores all of the chronological jobs, all of the scheduled tasks. And so it stands for the cron table, right? So the cron tab is the cron table file, and it's the chronological table file essentially. It holds all of the scheduled tasks. And this is the format to actually create a command inside of that file. And the command itself is going to spawn a reverse shell every 5 minutes to the attacker's IP. So this is actually a command line command, or I should say this. This piece right here is the scheduled portion, right? So this is how the scheduling looks like inside of the cron tab file. And again, refer to the Linux privilege escalation video to actually see a full version of this being executed. And so this is the scheduling element of it that actually looks like. And so this piece right here just implies that it's going to be running every 5 minutes. This one would be the day, this one would be the week, this one would be the month, etc. So these are just placeholders. And this specific piece right here implies minutes. So every 5 minutes, it's going to run bin bash, meaning it's going to spawn bash, and then it's going to run this command inside of bash. And this command is a netcat connection, requesting a connection to the attacker IP address, and then on this port, which is port 4444. Now, this piece sometimes does not work, so you don't necessarily have to do execute bin bash inside of your netcat command. Sometimes it just doesn't work, sometimes it works, but for the most part, the reliable element of this would be the NC portion, and then the attacker IP in 4444, which is netcat is going to try to connect to the IP address on this port. And this requires that on your attacking machine, you actually have a netcat listener or some kind of listener listening for remote connections. Otherwise, this will not work. This will run, the scheduled task will actually run. It's just it won't establish that connection unless you actually have a listener on your attacking machine. On whatever this machine is right here, this IP address, there needs to be a listener that is listening on that machine. So this will spawn a reverse shell every 5 minutes to that IP address, assuming that you have a listener going. Now, if we wanted to detect and mitigate scheduled task persistence on Windows, this is what we would do. We would run the commandlet get scheduled task, where the object has some kind of executable inside of it, right? So if there's a match inside of it, and this means that it's just in the name, right? So as long as there's an exe inside of the name of that scheduled task object, then you're going to see it, and you can look at all of the executables and see what the executable itself is. So if you recall from the previous slide, it was the scheduled task was Windows Update. That was the name of it. But the object itself actually had a payload.exe, right? So it's an executable that's going to run. It's a service, or it's basically a process that's going to run. And if that's the case, then you want to find all of the scheduled tasks that actually have an executable in it. And then from there, you can decipher whether or not those executables are malicious. And if you don't recognize any of them, you can just go ahead and look at the hash value for that executable, or look at the compiled code or the source code for that executable. and then compare it against VirusTotal or, you know, a variety of other databases that would tell you whether or not that executable is malicious, right? So this is from the defensive team's perspective, but from the team of pen testing, from the offensive team perspective, depending on what machine you are trying to create that scheduled task for, you would be able to do it either using this command or using the Windows command that previously we saw. And then one of the really cool things about this right here, and again, just refer to the Linux privilege escalation video because we go into really nice nuanced detail over it, but we can look at how to run the given scheduled task as a root user. Now, whether or not we would do it with a previously generated shell script that was generated by the root user and they deleted the script, right? But they forgot to delete the scheduled task. So now we can go and just recreate that script name exactly, put our own payload in it, and then the scheduled task will just run it for us at that interval, and then we'll end up getting that scheduled task or that file ran as a root user. That could be a way to do it. I know this kind of sounds a little bit complicated or complex. If you don't understand what I'm saying, please go watch that video because it will explain it. And then you can just go to the portion, the timestamp of the video that takes you to the scheduled task. But it's very, very useful. It's very handy, and it teaches you exactly what you would need to do to be able to establish a root reverse shell, not just a regular reverse shell. Although reverse shells in general, if you can just establish them, they're very handy, and you can use whatever that privilege level is to find higher privilege levels and then just repeat the process at a higher privilege level. But there are some ways that you can do it to actually, from the initial user that you are, to actually get a root user reverse shell using scheduled tasks. So all of those things are super exciting, and I recommend you go do some independent studies and go ahead and watch that Linux privilege escalation video. Okay, let's move on. The Linux version of this would just be to do crontab-L, and it will list all of the items that are inside of crontab. And you can also just pipe this, meaning feed it into a grep command, and inside of the grep command you can search for specific key phrases or patterns that might be interesting, or what you might expect or suspect to be potentially malicious commands that would be running. For example, looking for netcat connections, that could be something. So crontab-L is like a much more simpler version of trying to get the list of all of the scheduled tasks inside of Linux. But in general, the mitigation would be to monitor all task creation logs or events, right? So the event ID for a new task being created is 4698 in Windows, right? But if you just look at all of your files regularly, right, religiously almost, where you just look for whatever scheduled tasks are created and just keep track of them. And as they happen, you can remove them if they are malicious, and then block whoever was that removed them and launch a further investigation, so on and so forth. So it's just one of the best things that you can do is you can monitor those task creation logs. And then from the perspective of an attacker, you can look for task creation logs and see if any of them exist. And if they do exist, you want to wipe traces of your activities after you're done creating a task, so that if somebody's trying to do an investigation, they can't find those log items that points to tasks being created. Then we have restricting the cron job editing to privileged users. So this is one of those things where, you know, in the Linux privilege escalation video, we started at a lower level user, but we were able to modify or at least even access the cron job file. So just even if you want to be like super paranoid or super careful, you can remove even read access of on all of the crontab files, so that nobody other than privileged users, sudo users, admin users can actually view the contents of those scheduled tasks, right? So that would be another one of those things. And then auditing the scheduled tasks for unauthorized scripts is yet another one of those things. So when you find out that there's a scheduled task that's being created, you can immediately audit it to see whether or not it's malicious. But if you are being hired as the security engineer and there was a bunch of scheduled tasks that were already created and you just want to make sure that none of them are malicious, you can look at all of the ones that have been created to see if there are any unauthorized scripts that exist. And again, all of these things from the perspective of the attacker would be that, if it is a privileged user that can only do the cron job editing, then you have to try to find other ways to become a privileged user. But if it's not a privileged user, if somebody else can actually edit the cron tab file, then you can go ahead and potentially use one of the other attack techniques to gain root privileges or admin privileges and elevate the privileges that you have as a basic user. All right, next we have the service creation for persistence. So this falls under the persistence and expanding on that initial foothold that you have. So attackers can actually create malicious services that automatically start on reboot, right? So this could be, again, something that goes as a part of that scheduled task portion, but it runs on startup, right? So if you create a malicious Windows service using the service create, right? So SC create, and then the name of the service, and then the path to that service, which would end up being that executable. And then you would give it the start time of auto, meaning it starts automatically on startup. And then you do SC start malicious service. You can do that right away, right? You can actually do this right here where it automatically runs, or you can create it and then do SC start malicious service. And then there's SC stop malicious service if you want to stop something from running. But this registers a backdoor as a system service that launches on startup, right? So this could potentially be one of those vectors that you can take advantage of, one of those techniques you can take advantage of to create a malicious Windows service. The Linux version seems to be a little bit more intimidating, but it really isn't. So you would echo a command, right? So you would echo this specific piece, so this whole thing right here. You would echo that into this file, which is the configuration file for systemd and system backdoor.service. Technically, this is a new service that's being created, right? So you would go ahead and echo this command in its entirety inside of this file right here. And then you would do systemctl enable that, and then systemctl start that. And this ensures that the reverse shell launches every time that the system boots. And if we wanted to look at this a little bit closer, we have, this is just a \n, which gives us a new line. And we have a description, which is the backdoor, new line, service, new line, execute, start. And then what it's doing right here is executing bin bash again. And then this piece right here, which we looked at in the previous example, which is it's going to use bash to execute netcat, which will then try to execute another bash session on the attacker's IP address on this port number. And again, this part doesn't necessarily have to be included. If it actually works, that's amazing. If not, you can just use a version of netcat command right here without this specific element, or excuse me, this specific element. So you can use this full netcat command just without this little piece right here, and it will still establish that reverse shell for you as long as you have a listener on this attacker IP address. And that listener would also have to be on that port number in order for this connection to be established. As long as you have that listener running, then once this command actually runs, then you should be able to get that reverse shell connection, which would then allow you to either elevate your privileges or do a variety of other things. But this could also be done in a manner for which will actually, or through which I should say, a manner through which you can get root privileges from a lower level user once this command actually executes and you have that remote shell connection. That reverse shell connection could actually launch as a root user and not just a lower level normal user. This would require more advanced conversations. You can again refer to the Linux privilege escalation video. However, it is possible to go from a lower level user that can potentially execute a service, and then from that reverse shell connection, you would be able to gain root level or admin level privileges. To be able to detect these types of activities and mitigate against these services, these malicious services, on Windows, you can run a command called get service, and then you will look for executable or .exe or exe inside of that service, because I mean there could be a service name that has exe in it, so I would search for .exe potentially as a match, just so we can have that extension that we're looking for. But essentially you're looking for all of the services where the object name, right, has that exe, the object path name, we should even say. The object path name has exe inside of it, and then you would get all of those, and then you would see if any of those would be malicious through further investigation. For Linux, you can do systemctl list all of the units that are service types, and then you would just look at all the services that are running. This is going to be a big output, so you would use something similar to this for the piping of this command, so that you can look at specific types of services that are running, or specific names inside of the services that are running, that would potentially give you a more honed in approach, a sharper approach, because there's a very big chance that when you list all of the services, it's going to be a long list, and then you'll have to try to find some other way to sift and sort through all of that list. Now, the mitigations for this would be to monitor new service creations on Windows as event ID 7045, or to restrict access to the etc systemd system location, which prevents unauthorized service modifications. So this is obviously for Linux and Unix systems. This is obviously for Windows systems. And again, you're looking from the perspective of the defensive person when you look at these things, and you can look at these things from the perspective of an offensive person and be like, okay, well, how can I mitigate for this, right? How can I, as an offensive, as a pen tester person, how can I try to find ways to cover my tracks so that these types of things don't get me in trouble? Right, so maybe the executable, because there's a big possibility that there are multiple executables running on this Windows machine. So it's not like just because there's an executable or exe inside of the path name, this is automatically going to be a red flag. It's just that that's what we're looking for. So there are other ways that you can potentially disguise that service so it doesn't seem malicious, right? And then same thing for this one. If you're looking at services that are being listed inside of the systemctl output, then again, you can try to find ways to disguise that activity so it doesn't automatically pop out and stand out, and you would get yourself blocked and blacklisted immediately. So look at all of these defensive mitigation stuff also from the perspective of a pen tester, so you can see what the defenses are that you need to avoid, right? So that's a very important piece of all of these things as well. Okay, let's move on to reverse shells and backdoor implantation. So reverse shells for remote access. Again, there's another great video inside of the Junior Pen Tester training series. It's called What the Shell, and it's towards the end of the series, and it's already live and up and running. By the time you see this, it's going to be available. And it's a long video, and we talk about binding shells or bind shells as well as reverse shells, and we go through several exercises for creating bind shells and reverse shells. So this is something that the overview that you see right here is, there's a lot more information that can expand on it for you if you're willing to invest the time and the mental energy to actually go watch that video and learn more about it. So it'll be very, very handy and useful to you. But basically, reverse shells allow attackers to execute commands on compromised machines remotely. So a shell, right? So when you establish a shell, so think about the command line, right? If you've ever seen a command line, that's technically a shell. Now that shell can be remote connected to another machine, and it could be done through either a bind shell, which is me sending the request to a listener, or a reverse shell where I have the listener active on my machine, and from that side I'm trying to establish a connection to me, right? So they're essentially the same thing for trying to establish a remote shell or remote connection. It's just that the reverse shell is coming from the victim machine to my attack box, and my attack box, my attacking IP address, my attacking machine, is the one that's listening, right? So that's what reverse shells are. Now, reverse shells tend to be simpler and they tend to be a little bit more reliable. This is why it's one of the big topics inside of CompTIA PenTest Plus, but bind shells are also possible. So you need to know about both bind shells as well as reverse shells. But the overall concept is you establish a command line connection remotely. Now, this monster of a command that you see right here is a PowerShell reverse shell to the attacker's machine. The key elements here are this piece right here where you have the attacker IP on the port 4444, and then it's using the systemnet sockets TCP client object to actually establish this connection, right? And then the rest of it, it seems overwhelming, but there's a method to the madness that is this command right here. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a deeper explanation for this, but you don't need to know this piece by piece. If you do know it piece by piece, you'll be very proficient and you will have a really, I wouldn't say really easy time, but you would have an easier time to look at any kind of command that's similar to this. A lot of these things, for example, have to do with encoding. So when you see encoding right here, it doesn't have much to do with the functionality of the command, but what it does do, it helps you bypass antivirus and firewalls and intrusion detection systems, right? But when you look at the main portion of this, is this thing right here. This is like the big piece right here, which is going to establish that connection. And then after the fact, you have the stream variable that's created, and the stream variable is going to say client, which is this guy right here, this new object, this piece right here. It's going to say, hey, client, I want you to get the stream, and then at the byte level, etc., etc. So I'm going to go ahead and get the breakdown of this so that it makes a little bit more sense for you in case you're curious. This is a PowerShell script, and PowerShell it's like a PowerShell series of commands, I should say. And PowerShell tends to be, I think in my opinion, it's a little bit more complex than Bash scripting. Bash tends to be a little bit more straightforward, and Python tends to be a little bit more straightforward. So PowerShell is not as straightforward, but once you actually kind of wrap your head around what a commandlet typically looks like, which is, get stream. So there's like a verb and then there's a noun after the fact. New object, right? So all of these things, when you actually can recognize what a commandlet looks like, get bytes, right? Once you recognize those things, you can be like, oh, okay, this is a PowerShell script, number one. And number two, just by looking at what it is, you're like, oh, you know what? They're creating a new object, and that new object is fitting inside of this variable. And now this specific piece right here, this new variable is going to have that first variable that's going to have this other commandlet attached to it. And then we have a new variable, and those variables are going to, etc., etc. And then this piece of it is actually kind of like a while loop that you can see right here. So when you have basic understanding of scripting, then you can, for lack of a better word, decipher what a script is trying to do. But again, I'm just going to give you some more explanation on this, just so it makes your life a little bit easier and you can kind of understand this on a deeper level. Okay, so we start from the very beginning. We first establish the connection. So there's a variable called client that's being created here. And this client variable has a new object, and the object is system.net sockets TCP client that's trying to connect to this IP address on this port number. So it creates a TCP connection to the IP address on port 4444. And then we want to retrieve the stream. So this is another chunk right here. This gets the network stream object that's associated with that TCP connection that we just established. Then we receive and execute those commands. So the while loop that follows around, it continuously receives commands from the attacker and executes them using the IEX and then the data variable, which is invoke and expression. IEX is an acronym for the invoke expression commandlet, and the output of this would be captured and then sent back to the attacker. So this actually is just a repetitive loop that continuously receives commands from the attacker and then executes them on using the invoke expression, right? Then we have sending the output back to the attacker. So this is another variable that we're creating. Anything that starts with this $sign is essentially a variable in the syntax of Windows machines. And so this one has the first variable plus PS, which is just a literal PS that's going to be typed out, plus print working directory, and then get a path, plus this that's going to be typed out. So it adds a command prompt to the output, making it look like a standard PowerShell prompt. This is how you kind of cover your tracks a little bit. And then you have the stream variable, that very first one, write to it these bytes and this, which sends the output back to the attacker. And then you have the closing of the connection, which the client.close closes the TCP connection when the loop exits. So you remove yourself or remove whatever the live connection is, so that if they're running netstat to see what the network connections are, you no longer show up on those lists of connections, because you just established your quick little reverse shell and then you closed this connection so that you don't have to worry about it anymore. Something along those lines, right? So this is kind of like the gist of everything that we just looked at, but we can go ahead and kind of analyze this a little bit more, right? So if we were to look at this again, so we have that initial client variable, which is the new object, system net sockets, etc., TCP client. So all of this piece is one piece right here. So, and then these semicolons are the separators that separate these chunks of commands. So this is one piece right here, and that piece establishes that TCP connection to our attacking IP address, right? So it's going to connect back to our IP address on port 4444. And then we have the next piece, which is the stream variable, which is that client get stream. And then this right here, this is just the one little small chunk. So this gets the network stream object that's associated with that TCP connection. And then we have the next piece right here, which falls into our while loop right here. So this piece, so let's try to find the semicolon that separates this whole thing, which is right here. So it says while the integer, or the increment, I should say, reads bytes at this much, because we've established this in advance. So it goes from 0 to 65,535, which is the number of ports. So it goes while this is the bytes that we have right there, and it goes from 0 to the full length of the bytes. Then I want you to execute this new object type name system text ASCII encoding, get the string of the bytes, etc. Right? So this continuously receives commands from the attacker and executes them using the IEX data element, which is going to be this piece right here. So we have the send back. So we've created a send back. I want to say that it's here somewhere. Or I'm sorry, we're creating the send back. My apologies. So we're creating the send back variable right here, which executes the IEX, which is the invoke expression, and it does it on the data variable, which was created inside of our while loop right here, which is the inside of the data variable. We have a new object type system text ASCII encoding. So this send back will do invoke expression of this data, and it's going to be an output string. And then we have the second send back that we created that's supposed to be our kind of like trickery to try to make it seem like this is legitimate. And then it's going to have the send byte, right? So the stream will actually send those bytes, which sends the output back to the actual attacker. And then finally we have client close and stream flush, meaning it just wipes the stream variable. So it's complex, right? You need to have a good understanding of PowerShell scripting, which I couldn't even give you all of that because I don't have, my strongest language is Python. So I had to go ahead and get an explanation for you to try to get this a little bit better for you. However, I know enough of PowerShell to understand that, okay, they're creating a couple of variables throughout this process. These variables are invoking these certain connections. The big thing that stands out to me based on previous exercises is this piece right here, which is that TCP client attacker ID, etc., because this is trying to connect to the attacker IP on this port via TCP. So that piece, I'm like, oh, this is a remote connection. Like whatever this is right here, this whole thing is trying to do a remote connection to this attacker IP on that port number, right? That one is a dead giveaway. And then from that, I understand, oh, this is trying to establish a remote connection. It's going to be doing it through whatever this port is, which means they're launching a shell They're trying to do a remote connection to the command line so that they can have a C2 server, a command and control connection to this machine, whatever this machine is that this is being run on, so that they have a persistent connection, right? They have persistence on this machine. And this creates an interactive PowerShell session for remote control. That's basically what this whole giant thing is trying to do right here. Now, here's how amazingly simple it is when you run it from a Linux machine. So this is coming from the victim machine, right? So the victim machine that was just a Windows machine is now coming from a Linux machine, and we're just doing a netcat to the connection of the attacker IP port 4444. We've already seen this in multiple instances, for example, the scheduled tasks and the services that were created, except now we're just doing it directly from Linux, and we're the Linux command line, we're just typing this out, pressing enter, and it creates that reverse shell. This just requires that there's a listener waiting on the other side on the attacker's IP. And same thing with the Windows command that we just saw. It requires that there's a listener waiting on the attacker's IP so that when that command actually runs, this connection can be established on port 4444. So detecting these types of things, it would be to monitor outbound connections to unusual IPs. So first of all, just monitor all of the outbound connections, whether or not they're legitimate or not, because you don't know if that outbound connection has been hijacked by somebody malicious and now they're running commands on behalf of the quote-unquote legitimate user. So you want to monitor all of the outbound connections to unusual IPs. You want to use host-based firewalls to block reverse shell traffic. Host-based firewall resides on the host that is being connected to, and it blocks reverse shell traffic. So there's a certain type of traffic that you can actually block on that host-based firewall, especially if the host in question is a very important host, a data server, for example, or some kind of sensitive machine that has the users that have been installed on it, or connections, or it's on a subnet that is a very sensitive subnet, and you want to make sure that that specific host on that subnet, or we should say all of the hosts on that subnet, have a host-based firewall that blocks reverse shell traffic. And then implement application whitelisting to prevent unauthorized script execution. So this means very similar to blacklisting, right? So application whitelisting means that there's a handful of applications that are allowed to run and everything else is blocked by default, right? So you have a default deny or a default blacklist, and then there's a handful of applications that have been whitelisted that are allowed to run, and then everything else is unauthorized and it's not allowed to run, it's not allowed to execute anything. Commandlets can be blocked in this manner. There are a lot of things that you can block when you go into the nuanced details of things. So you can actually whitelist a handful of things, and then everything else by default can be blocked, because it's easier to do that than to allow everything and then try to block, a million different things. So you can block everything and then just allow a handful of things. Backdoor implantation was actually another attack type that we covered inside of the Linux privilege escalation video. And make FIFO, make first in, first out, creates a pipe, right? And then it creates it in this location. And then the netcat listener. So in this particular case, this machine is implementing a netcat listener on port 4444. And then this backpipe, this pipe that was just created, this make FIFO, this is going to be connected to that listener. And then there's going to be a bin bash, so binary of bash, that's going to launch when that happens. And then this entire piece right here, this wonderful piece right here, is going to be forwarded to our backpipe that was just created. And then 2.1 is going to just remove all of the errors or any kind of permission error type of situation. So make FIFO is a really interesting command that will create a backdoor. Essentially, it's going to create a pipe that will be available for you so that you can go ahead and connect to it at your leisure, essentially. So this also will launch a shell, a remote connection shell. It's just a much more, I would say, sophisticated way of creating that shell or having access to that remote connection by actually creating a backdoor, like an open pipe that goes from this machine to your machine, and then you can connect to it at any point on this port 4444. And here's another way that we can do this using MSF Venom to actually create a backdoor and then hide it in a legitimate Windows executable, for example, notepad.exe. And just after having gone through so many of these pen testing exercises and seeing how often notepad.exe is used for malicious intent, I'm literally so suspicious of any kind of instance of notepad.exe where I'm like, I wonder if there's somebody that's using this to establish some kind of a remote shell or something. But it's like there are so many people that actually use it as just a basic text file to keep notes or kind of like a sticky note or something, that it's like you would, I mean, in an environment where there, or in an enterprise environment where there are like thousands of employees, you can rest assured that a few dozen, if not a few hundred of them, are going to have a legitimate instance of Notepad running, which is what makes this such a great attack vector. It's like it's a legit tool, it's a legit piece of software that's being used, but it's also one of the most attractive elements of attackers. So MSF Venom is something that we talked about when we created the Metasploit videos inside of the Junior Pentester Training Series. So when you go through those Junior Pentester Training Series towards the end, you're going to find several videos, I think 4 videos on Metasploit. And then inside of that, we do a bunch of payload creation using MSF Venom, which is one of the adjacent kind of ancillary pieces of the Metasploit framework, and it creates payloads. So this is how you call on MSF Venom. The payload that we want to create is a Windows Meterpreter, which is basically Metasploit's version of saying a reverse shell, and it's going to be a reverse TCP connection, and then the listening host is the attacker's IP address, and then the listening port is 4444. The format is an executable, and then we're going to output this whole thing inside of this notepad.exe file. And then this payload needs to be transferred to the actual victim machine. And then from there, whenever it runs, right? So you could actually have this be a scheduled task, for example. And whenever that runs and this executable launches, there's going to be a connection attempt to this IP address on this port, which means you need to have a listener on this IP address on that port, so that whenever this attempt connection is done, or connection attempt is done, whenever that happens, you actually have a listener that can capture that connection attempt, and then now you have a backdoor or another attempt at a reverse shell. So MSF Venom is very, very powerful. It's super freaking handy because you can create a bunch of executables and payloads and a variety of different formats for Windows, for Linux, for Unix, etc., for Android, for iOS, all of those things. So there's a lot of great things that you can do with MSF Venom. It is a hacker's best friend, in my humble opinion. Metasploit in general, that framework is massive and it's super, super useful to hackers and pen testers. So that would be one of those things that I would, again, encourage you to go discover and do some independent studies so you can learn more about Metasploit. In the lab portion of this training series for CompTIA PenTest Plus, when we get to the practical element and we start doing labs and things like that, we're going to be using Metasploit a lot. And this is going to be one of those, again, it's just going to be probably your favorite tool in your hacker toolbox, so to speak. The mitigations against backdoors would be to scan system binaries for unauthorized modifications. So any kind of modification to a system binary, which is the most sensitive files on a system. Any modification that's done to that should be looked at very closely. Normal users should not have permission to modify system binaries. So that's one of the key things that you can do to try to avoid this kind of attack taking place, is to look for all of the system binaries and block access to them and only allow admins and root users to be able to do it. And then use endpoint detection and response EDR tools to detect malicious processes. So this is kind of just an advanced monitoring tool that will allow for malicious processes, and it will scan any kind of process that's running to see if there is some kind of a payload inside of it that would be malicious, right? It'll look at this Notepad executable and it'll say, hey, you know what? This doesn't seem right. This should not be running inside of this executable. that's a funky little thing that's going on, or this interpreter thing that's running inside of this executable, that's funky, that should not be running. So EDR tools are very, very useful in that regard. Now, from the perspective of the attacker, when you look at these mitigations, you are going to scan the system for system binaries that you can modify, that your level user, whatever you're connected as, can actually modify that thing. And if that's the case, you want to go after that to try to create some kind of a binary or some kind of modification to that binary so that you can establish your backdoor. And then again, look for, it's kind of hard to see if there's an endpoint detection and response, but usually what happens is on the host that's running, there is some kind of a connection that's established to a server somewhere else that is detecting and monitoring that specific host. So if you're logged into a host that you just hacked into, you can actually look at the list of connections and the list of tasks, services, all those things that are running. And from that list, you might be able to notice that, oh, hey, there's a connection to Splunk that's running on this thing. So this is probably being monitored by a tool. So I should be a little bit more careful as I go about this. So you can look through the active connections and through the current tasks that are running on a machine to see if there is actually an EDR tool that's connected to it. All right, so now let's talk about these C2 frameworks for long-term control. So what is a command and control framework? Or why don't we start with what is command and control? Now, command and control is basically everything that we've been talking about so far. You have one server or one machine that's connected to another machine, and the first one is controlling the second one. So our attacker IP that we've seen in all of these examples, that attacker IP is controlling the victim machine. It has command and control over that machine. And we call this a C2 server or a C2 connection. Now, there are ways, just like everything else we've talked about up until this point, especially in the attacks and exploits module, there are tools that can make this a little bit easier for you. So for example, a framework that can actually establish a C2 connection for you, and then as a part of that, you can control multiple compromised machines from a central server, and that will allow you to encrypt the communication to evade detection. It'll allow you to deploy new payloads and move laterally through the networks because you can do it through this massive framework, very similar to what Metasploit actually does. These specific frameworks have been designed for this type of work. It's just designed for command and control. And when you have something that's dedicated to an activity like this, there are a lot of neat little features that are attached to it. For example, encrypting the entire communication, which allows you to send commands back and forth, and they won't be seen as plain text, so they're just harder to detect those commands that you're running through your connection. So this is a really, really cool series of tools, and they're very useful when it comes down to pen testing. Cobalt Strike is the first one. So this is a commercial grade C2 framework used for stealthy post exploitation, meaning this is commercial grade. Anytime you see that, that means there's like a paid version. There's an expensive paid version. This creates a persistent beacon in Cobalt Strike. A beacon sends out the connection request or sends out the data connection beacon. Like, think about a beacon. It's like an antenna, right? So it's sending out a persistent beacon in Cobalt Strike. So there's a PowerShell command that's going to have a hidden window, which is very, very important in this whole process. And so a new object is being created in a hidden window, and it's going to run this invoke expression, which is a web client downloading the string beacon PS1, which is going to download this PowerShell script. So you see PS1, anytime you see .ps1 in the extension, just understand that that's a PowerShell script that is running or being downloaded. So this invoke expression command is essentially downloading this script. And so it's going to now download, and this would probably be a part of a series of commands that would then run this script. And this script is going to make the machine that it's downloaded on, it's going to make it act as a beacon that will allow us to connect to it using Cobalt Strike. So running a PowerShell-based beacon that calls home to the C2 server. Now this beacon right here is available through Cobalt Strike, so it just kind of does a lot of the work for you this piece right here is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. This is basically just a glorified command to download something from the internet, and then once it's downloaded, that piece right there is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. Now, this is the download page for Cobalt Strike. This is available through download.cobaltstrike.com/download. And when you land on there, it's asking you for a license key because this is a commercial grade tool that you got to pay for. So if we actually go to their homepage, or no, it actually even tries to connect us to this. So if this is it. So this is their homepage right here, cobaltstrike.com. You can actually request pricing, meaning that this is not just a standard tiered pricing. There are multiple products here. So we do have, under the product line, we have the beacon, we have malleable, interoperability, community, flexibility, UDRL, and then there are, just a variety of other things that are available. And then of course there are bundles that you can purchase right here. These things are not cheap. Anytime, this is kind of like something that I've established after some experience. Anytime you see request pricing, you can just rest assured that this thing is not cheap. So how much is the average license of Cobalt Strike? So let's see what the internet tells us for the pricing of this. So the average license based on a 1-year license for Cobalt Strike costs as low as $3,540 per user. The price is also for responsible buyers, as developer Fortra vets all prospective users before purchase, which is very, very nice. It's like ethical of them because they're creating a command and control software. So obviously they want to vet all of the people who want to buy it to make sure that they're not selling their software to malicious actors, which I actually respect. So it's not just a part of selling something expensive. It's also to vet the users so that nobody malicious uses it, which, that my mind didn't go there. My mind automatically was like, oh, they're going to charge us $1 million for this. But it's, I guess, relative to what it can do, it's not that expensive. $35.40 is not that bad relative to the power that this thing has. So just a couple of quick bullet points here. So the features, some of the key features, because you just saw that there's a bunch of things you can do. So it deploys fileless payloads to evade antivirus detection, meaning that there are no files that can be downloaded because most antivirus software looks for the file itself and it scans the file itself. So if you can deploy a payload without a file being downloaded, then antivirus or some of the more basic antivirus tools can't detect you, therefore you can evade the strike or avoid being detected, avoid your strike being detected. MSF Venom is another one of these things that can actually, when you establish a Meterpreter connection using MSF Venom, or I should say Metasploit Meterpreter is one of these things that also has a fileless payload that you can actually establish the connection without a file being downloaded. Therefore, it helps to evade antivirus detection. Mimicking legitimate network traffic to bypass monitoring. That's what it looks like because it's going to encrypt it. It's going to mimic a lot of it could be establishing the connection on one of the more common ports that are used for normal network traffic instead of using port 4444 because that just automatically is a red flag. It's like, what is this for? Like, again, after doing so many different pen testing exercises, anytime I see port 4444 or 7777 or anything like that inside of a log file when I'm doing analysis, I'm like, oh, that's for sure like a connection from Metasploit or something, or like a netcat connection or something like that. So when you use legitimate ports or try to mimic legitimate network traffic on port 443 or on port 80 or on port 53 or any of these super common ports, then it's like, okay, it's a little bit harder to be detected. And then sleeping commands to reduce detection risk, which is also really handy. Sleep basically idles the command or the connection that you're trying to do or sending packets or data or anything like that. When you put sleep 10, it pauses for 10 seconds, right? Or if you do sleep 300, it pauses for 300 seconds. So these types of things actually makes the connection seem less hazardous, because it's not this active connection that's sending 1 million packets per second. It's sleeping. It's taking its time before sending these packets back and forth and these frames back and forth. So it's harder to detect and it's harder to flag as malicious. Now, detecting and mitigating Cobalt Strike would be to monitor for unusual HTTPS traffic patterns, because HTTPS is encrypted. So when you look for HTTPS traffic, you're looking at encrypted traffic, but because it's encrypted, it's very hard to decrypt if you don't have the key for that. So you're looking at the patterns of the traffic that would end up being your alerts or your red flags. So what types of, at what time of the day are these connections being made? What is the data that is trying to be accessed through this connection? What port number is this on, right? And a variety of different things that you can ask for. This could be one of those things that you can go ahead and chat with Meta AI or Gemini or GPT and just be like, hey, listen, when it comes down to using Cobalt Strike, if I'm trying to detect this, what type of HTTPS traffic patterns should I be on the lookout for that might imply that somebody is actually using Cobalt Strike against me? And then when you learn about that, you can make sure that you account for that as an attacker to make sure you don't do those things so that you're not detected. And you're using behavioral analysis to detect command execution anomalies. So behavioral analysis essentially means that you have a baseline of activity that you expect to happen on a given machine or on a given network. And that baseline is all the normal behavior. And everything that falls out of that baseline is considered an anomaly. So if you have a really strong baseline, anything that falls out of that would be something that would raise a red flag. And then you have blocking outbound traffic to known Cobalt Strike domains, which is just really good work as a security engineer. Just you look for all of the known Cobalt Strike domains, which you can find through a few different Google searches. It's not that complicated, that hard to find. And then everything that's known as a Cobalt Strike domain, you block. And it's fairly straightforward. That's like a really easy, straightforward, low-hanging fruit kind of a defensive strategy that you should definitely consider if you're on the defensive team or on the purple team. Let's say you're looking at defensive strategy through the lens, through the perspective of a pen tester, which is the purple team. Our next one is Empire, the open source PowerShell C2 framework. So open source, key phrase here. So this is the opposite of a commercial tool. It's free. So it's an open source post-exploitation framework for PowerShell and Python-based attacks. So it helps you create a persistent stager or a persistent connector. Now, a stager is another one of those things that we talked about when we were looking at the Metasploit videos, because we were talking about staged and stageless types of payloads that can be used. And a staged payload comes in two pieces, right? So there's the stager, which is that initial payload that goes through. It's a smaller file, and it establishes the connection to download the staged or the second part of the stage, I should say. So this will essentially invoke another web expression, right? So it can download a string, which is being the empire.ps1 file. So it's downloading the stager. And then when the stager launches, which is this script right here, when it launches, it runs the rest of it, which ends up downloading the rest of the pieces. So this downloads and executes an Empire payload in memory, meaning in your random access memory, in your RAM memory. And when it does that, it does not download something directly into the hard drive. It does it in a volatile memory that will wipe every time that the machine is fully restarted. So this helps to, again, kind of one of those things where you will run the payload without actually setting off, hopefully you will run it without setting off too many red flags or too many alerts. So now there are a few different ways that we can look at getting access to Empire. So there is a GitHub repository from what I understand. Now this one right here, it says it was updated in the last year. So seems to be one of the more recent ones. Based on the AI output that we received up here, it said that the most recent version was maintained by BC Security. And then we have the Kali Linux website that also has it as one of the packages and binaries that can be downloaded and installed. So this is the PowerShell Empire that is available that you can download and install on your distribution of Kali Linux. And I tend to have a lot of reliance on the Kali.org website because it's where Kali Linux can be downloaded, and then you can rest assured. For example, compared to downloading something from GitHub that can actually be modified, you can be a little bit more rest assured that downloading it from Kali.org is a bit safer. So this is the various ways that you can actually get access to the Empire framework. Some of the key features of Empire is that it has fileless execution to avoid disk forensics. It has modules for privilege escalation and lateral movement, and it evades traditional signature-based detection. So some of the things that you really look for in a tool like this. And so when you're detecting and mitigating the Empire C2 activity, you want to monitor for PowerShell processes that are running in hidden mode. For example, that -w hidden command, which is running a command or running a window essentially in hidden mode. So you definitely want to look out for anything like that that's running in the background. You want to inspect outbound traffic for connections to unknown C2 servers. Very, very basic element right here, but very important. And then you want to disable PowerShell for non-administrative users, which is again really, really important, right? So this is one of the key things that when I got hired at the job that I'm at right now, the very first thing on the first day that I did was I was like, let me see if I can open up PowerShell. And I could. And they have to let me use it because I do need to use it. But there are a lot of things that I am not allowed to do on PowerShell. And I can't download Python. I can't install Python. I can't run any kind of a Python file. And it's, there are definitely limitations to what I am allowed to do. But that was like the first thing I did. I was like, ooh, it's a Windows machine. Let me see if I can launch PowerShell. So you want to see from the perspective of the attacker, from the pen tester, that's also something that you want to check for to see, I wonder if I could run PowerShell. Let's see what we can do here. And with that, we have arrived at our practice questions for Module 5, Section 1. And these are all the stuff for establishing, maintaining persistence. Just like everything else that we've done with practice questions so far, I got to give you a couple of disclosures just so you understand where all of this stuff is coming from. Number one, we are forbidden from sharing the actual questions that are going to be available on the CompTIA PenTest Plus examination. There are NDAs that are signed that legally prohibit us from sharing those questions, because then people can just study the questions and memorize the answers, and that way they can kind of hack their way into passing the exam without actually really knowing what they're talking about, and then they get access to something that can potentially give them like too much power that they haven't earned, right? And the other piece of that is, honestly, even if you had all of those questions, there are so many different variations of the examination, because there are like hundreds of questions, but you don't get to see hundreds of questions in the exam. So there are so many different randomized variations of the exams that it's very difficult to try to memorize everything and think that you've prepared yourself for something. So that's one. The second piece is that these questions I have not seen myself. I compiled them, I put them inside of this slideshow, but to maintain authenticity and to try to go through this with the same eyes that you're going through it, I did not review these questions in advance to try to find the answer. So there are occasionally questions that I will not have a very, confident answer to. And that does not necessarily mean that I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, which is something that I have seen previously in the comment. It was literally actually one person that commented on it, but it sat on my heart and it upset me. And I just want to make sure that I point that out. This is not something that I studied in advance, right? I'm going through these questions the first time, similar to what you're going through, and I was just kind of in a zone when I was copying and pasting everything inside of these slides, because I just didn't want to sit there and like analyze each question just to memorize it in advance, because it kind of prevents me from thinking through it. Which brings me to my very last point. What I'm going to go through here is the method that I take to approach these questions, to use critical thinking and process of elimination and a variety of different tactics to actually mentally work through the question. And from there, we find the answer. And so what I want to teach you is that process. I want to teach you how to think and how to come to your own conclusions, so that you don't have to sit there and memorize questions and answers, but you can attack any question that is presented to you and feel confident that you can find the answer for it. And finally, I don't know if I said finally on the last one, but finally, we have multiple choice questions. We have multiple response questions that require more than one response, more than one answer. And then we have scenario-based questions. And then as we go through the scripting portion and the lab exercises at the end of this training series, you will learn how to analyze scripts, and you'll learn how to analyze code and essentially run through the practical elements of a pen test so that you can recognize those types of practice questions as well. All right, question 1. Which of the following best describes the purpose of persistence in a pen test? To increase password cracking speed, to evade intrusion detection systems permanently, to maintain access to a compromised system after reboot or termination, to escalate privileges immediately upon exploitation. So this is actually really great series of answers here, because some of them, these last three especially, are, I can like make an argument for why all of them would actually be an answer to this. So number 1 is not to increase password cracking speed. That has nothing to do with persistence really in a pen test. To evade intrusion detection systems permanently, that piece right there is kind of suspicious, but you definitely want to evade intrusion detection. That's one good thing about it. To maintain access to a compromised system, that part's great. After reboot or termination, that part is a little bit suspicious. And then we have to escalate privileges immediately upon exploitation. This is not really a part of persistence, so I'm going to eliminate D. This is more privilege escalation, and upon exploitation, you want to try to escalate your privileges. That doesn't necessarily fall under persistence, although privilege escalation can be a part of persistence. But I think they're saying the best description of the purpose of persistence, and for me, it would be either B or C. Now, to maintain access to a compromised system sounds much more likely in my mind than to evade intrusion detection permanently. So I'm going to say C, but it could be B. So let's see if I'm right or wrong. Okay, great. It's C. That's excellent. Okay, I'm very excited about that. Okay, which Windows feature is most commonly abused to create persistence via scheduled execution? So this is a very big key here. So registry keys, task scheduler, the obvious answer. I would go for the obvious answer. Windows Defender policies, DNS caching service. So it's definitely not the DNS thing. Windows Defender policies is not abused to create persistence via scheduled execution. So for me, it's B. I'm just going to say B. There you go. Task scheduler, there's scheduled execution. I don't think there are going to be very many questions that are going to be this obvious, but process of elimination here. Okay, moving on to the next one. Which C2 command and control framework is commercial and widely used in red team operations? And that would be Cobalt Strike. Metasploit framework is open source, although it does have a enterprise paid version. Empire is open source. Beef is also another open source tool that is the browser exploitation framework. And so the browser exploitation framework is enough. It can actually be used for command and control, because you technically hook somebody's browser, and through that you can try to do a variety of other tasks. But they're asking about a C2 framework specifically, and Cobalt Strike is the one that is commercial and widely used. So a reverse shell differs from a bind shell. See, we did talk about this. You see, it wasn't in the documentation, but I did mention it, and I would highly recommend you go check out the What the Shell video. So a reverse shell differs from a bind shell in that it encrypts traffic with SSL by default. That's not true. The victim machine initiates the connection back to the attacker. That's true. It cannot bypass firewalls. Also not true. It requires elevated privilege to launch. That's also not true. The most likely answer, which is like 100%, the victim machine initiates the connection back to the attacker. If the attacker initiates the connection to the victim, that's called a bind shell. When the victim initiates it to the attacker, it's a reverse shell. Yes. Which Linux persistence technique creates a service that executes malicious payloads on boot? So SSH key injection is not it. This is more for remote connections using somebody's SSH key instead of their password. Systemd unit service creation. This is a persistence technique that creates a service. Firewall rule manipulation does not create a service. You can manipulate firewall rules, sure, but you're not creating a service that executes malicious payloads. And cron job deletion is also not creating a service. It's deleting a chronological job, a scheduled task. So systemd unit service creation, yes. Which of the following are common methods attackers use to establish persistence? Select 2 here. So creating scheduled tasks, yes. Installing backdoors, yes. Hashcat brute force attacks. Hashcat dumps hash values for people's credentials. So this is not necessarily it. This could be potentially a part of this whole process, but it's not the obvious answer. Packet sniffing with Wireshark is network system monitoring or traffic monitoring, and it could lead to man-in-the-middle attacks and things like that. So it has nothing to do with using it to establish persistence. A and B would be the answers here. Which of the following are considered C2 frameworks that support persistence operations? So we're going to select 2 here. Wireshark is a traffic monitor. Empire and Cobalt Strike are C2 frameworks. Nmap is an enumeration tool. It's a network mapper, network scanner. So B and C. Which persistence techniques are most likely to survive a reboot on Windows systems? Select 2. Registry run keys, Windows services, in-memory PowerShell payloads, ARP spoofing. ARP spoofing is address resolution protocol that deals with mostly MAC addresses. So it's another way of just saying that you're spoofing MAC addresses or ARP connections. And we have registry run keys that I don't think they fall into this. B and C tend to be kind of like the common answers here, but Windows services is one of those persistent techniques, and an in-memory PowerShell is another one of those things that I believe it should survive a reboot. Oh no, see, I was wrong, and I just said that B and C tend to be the other one. In memory, that's actually, you know what? That was a very silly mistake. In memory implies that it's in the random access memory, and if it's in random access memory, that gets wiped on reboot. Whenever you reboot a machine, the RAM memory, the in-memory, whatever is there, gets wiped. So that was actually a really silly mistake on my part. That was stupid. So registry run keys, even though I kind of don't understand what that means. I know it's part of the Windows registry, and you can establish a key inside of the registry. So that kind of I can deduce what that means. In Windows services, I know that works. But in-memory PowerShell payloads, that was a stupid answer. So the answer is A and B. All right, scenario. A pen tester gains system-level access on a Windows server. They want to maintain a persistence. They want to maintain persistence so that their payload executes every time the machine reboots. They configure a malicious binary to launch via this registry key. So what technique is the tester using? That is the registry run key persistence right here. So this is when you see HKLM and things like this is a registry path right here. So that is great. Systemd service has to do with Linux, so it's not Windows. Reverse shell is just a type of remote connection that you can establish. We're talking about system level access. They want to maintain persistence. So this will be the big piece right here. Beaconing C2 implant can work, except this is not what we're talking about right here. So registry run keys is what we're doing. During a red team engagement, you compromise a Linux host inside a financial network. To ensure persistence, you create a cron job that runs your script every 30 minutes. Which persistence does this best represent? It would be a scheduled task, which is a cron job. This is also a dead giveaway because cron job is in the answer, and it says in the question as well. A WPS brute force attack, not really. Kerberos golden ticket, also not really, because this is a part of the ticket granting service and ticket granting ticket process for credentials. WPS brute force was WPS. Oh, what does that stand for? We definitely talked about it here, and I am drawing a blank on this one. But this is not it. And a reverse shell could be a part of this, but this is a scheduled task specifically that we are launching. An attacker compromises a host and implants a backdoor that connects to a Cobalt Strike beacon. The beacon checks in with the C2 server every 60 seconds, allowing the attacker to issue commands, upload files, So which persistent strategy is this an example of? This is, I accidentally scrolled down. It is a C2 framework persistence because Cobalt Strike is a C2 framework. Service injection, we're not injecting anything into a server or a service, I should say. We have task scheduler that potentially can be, because it's every 60 seconds, that's kind of like a trick right here. That's saying every 60 seconds, so it kind of makes you think of a task that's being scheduled. And an in-memory payload, this does not imply anything that has to do with that. And especially if it's implanting a backdoor in memory, as we established in a previous question, gets wiped every single time that the system is rebooted. So this would not be a good backdoor option because it would get wiped every single time. So C2 framework persistence. A pen tester installs a backdoor that creates a reverse shell to their attack machine only when the victim visits a specific website. This allows stealthy on-demand persistence. So specific website right here is an encrypted, right? Do they talk about encryption? No, it doesn't. But if it's visiting a website, I'm going to assume that it's an encrypted conversation. It's an encrypted connection, HTTPS, remember? So this allows stealthy, which is again encryption, and on-demand persistence. So this is there are a few hints in here that tell us that this is an encrypted connection. So which of the following best describes this? Task scheduler abuse, no. System depersistence, no. Conditional reverse shell backdoor, VPN credential theft. This does not. This is actually tricky. I know it's not task scheduler. Watch it be task scheduler. I know it's not A. I would say conditional reverse shell backdoor. That could be it. It could be a conditional reverse shell backdoor. It could be it. System depersistence. This has to do with services, and I don't think this has anything. So I don't think it's A or B. It would be between C and D. VPN credential theft. So a VPN allows you to have stealthy website connections, right? So it's a virtual private network and encrypts your connections. So that is interesting, but it's credential theft that is kind of throwing me off, because it would just mean that you got their credentials and now you're logging into their VPN server or their VPN connection. So I think the closest answer is C here. Excellent. Nice. And with that, we have wrapped the section 5.1 practice questions. So this was nice. There were a couple of them that really challenged me, and I am excited when I get challenged in these questions and I can't automatically just find an answer. There were a couple of them that were like super obvious. So that's that. But hopefully this kind of allowed you to understand the way that I approach these questions, and hopefully it taught you how to approach these questions as well. And then you can always take my approach, combine it with your own approach and approaches that you've learned from other people to really amplify your skill set as somebody who is going to take exams, and just really kind of how to do critical thinking to try to find the answers that you're looking for in your investigations and in your exercises. So if you have any questions about what we talked about today, please drop them in the comment section below. If you have any comments that you want to drop them in the comment section below. You can get access to this slideshow as well as the notes document that I was using for the lecture portion of this video with Hackaholics Anonymous, and you'll get a quick little note about that on how you can get access to these things, as well as all the scripts and everything we're going to create when we get into the practical lab exercises of this training series. And refer to the What the Shell video, as well as the Linux privilege escalation and Windows privilege escalation videos that are inside of the Junior Pen Tester training series. They're going to be the videos at the very, very end. So go look for those videos, because they will help you really understand everything that we're talking about, or we talked about in this video, as well as all the other stuff we're going to talk about when we go into persistence and privilege escalation and things like that. So in the next chapter, we're going to be talking about lateral movement techniques. And until then, it's your boy Hank Hackerson at Hank Hacks Hackers, your favorite network and system attacker / protector. If no one else loves you, Hank loves you. And I will see you in next week's episode. Later. To get the PenTest Plus notes, practice questions, and to join a supportive community of like-minded people like you, consider joining the Hackaholics Anonymous membership community. We have 4 tiers: the supporter, the agent, the guardian, and the master. And each tier gets their own Discord server and early access to content. The agent, guardian, and master levels will get exclusive content like line-by-line code explanations for how to create cybersecurity and PenTest Plus scripts, like exclusive downloads that they will get. For example, the notes document for this PenTest Plus and everything that I'm using for the lectures, as well as all of the practice questions and everything else that will go along that will be made for the scripts and everything else that we're going to be doing for the PenTest Plus training series. There will be free pre-made monthly Python automations that have to do with system administration, cybersecurity defense, as well as, of course, PenTest Plus and ethical hacking. And then there's going to be monthly live streams with me every single month, plus so many other things that you would get as a part of being a member of Hackaholics Anonymous in these tiers. To join, you can simply click the link in the description below, or you can go to our homepage and click the join button there. Or you can go to youtube.com/@HankHacksHackers/join, and you'll be able to join Hackaholics Anonymous.